it's difficult, it's, finding it hard, etc. That's part of the process of reading, and you have to find strategies, whether those strategies involved maybe getting the illustrated version of Jane Eyre and watching the films, of interacting, of reading sections, very much in the way that we need to adapt things for the classroom. That would have been a focus for you in English 2. This is English 4. English 4, we're going to look at Jane Eyre. And it's a book that some of you are reading. I think it's well worth taking on. And I think once you get into the mode and the mind of a Bronte sister, I think you'll find that it becomes easier after a short period of time. Obviously, it helps to have that initial motivation. Jakob was saying about Frankenstein that he's always wanted to read it, and that can get you through the some of the vagaries, the difficulties of a text from another time era. You could similarly be reading very difficult postmodern texts from our own era. It would be incredibly challenging and would force you to look up words left, right, and centre. They'd be challenging you probably potentially for other reasons. But let's keep this brief before lunch. Welcome back to everybody who's watching online. You should be able to see my screen and Jane Eyre, which is an important book, and a book that has come in for a lot of critical attention because it became a classic at a very early stage and has been a canonical text within English literature. And it features the figure of Bertha Mason and this empire and colonialism, and how it features in a text that potentially at first glance seems to be about merry old England, well, not merry old England, misty, moory old England, perhaps Gothic England, but it's been read and critically reappraised according to the fact that the Caribbean, the empire, plantations, the sugar industry, slavery, all these issues can't help, they're pushed out in this sort of Gothic romance, but they can't help but come and sort of almost breach back in the way that the supernatural sort of breaches into a Gothic tale. Classically old, evil, unmodern world. Here, when it does, it's in the figure of the mad woman in the attic, and the mad woman in the attic is actually a Creole born of a master and a slave, and has this backstory that means that when the supernatural rips in, it's not the supernatural at all that's doing the sort of Gothic penetration, if you will. Instead, it's colonialism and slavery and all the darker sides of imperial exoticism. Second edition from 1897, when you read the cover, I think it's in here as well, it says an autobiography, and that's an important aspect of this book, that it's seen as a sort of an autobiographic novel on the part of Charlotte Bronte, even if it was published under the name of Currer Bell. Again, very typical 19th century technique, and used a lot by excuse me, something's just happening there. And used a lot by women in the 19th century as well, often writing under pseudonyms or as males. Interesting thing when you look at the story of Jane Eyre, and something that if you look on the YouTube stuff as well, that Professor Bowen points out, is that essentially it's kind of a rerun of a fairy tale, and there's a lot of folklore and fairy tale that's drawn in on it, and that she's a sort of Cinderella type figure, which, when you think about it, really emphasizes the fact that this is a sort of realistic tale on one level, but it's sort of blended not only with the Gothic, but the Gothic that's sort of like resting upon, almost like a rerunning of the Cinderella story. In fact, Bronte draws on quite a lot of folklore, and there's Charles Perrault, who's a great collector of folklore and fairy tales. We've got the Grimm brothers, you've got Perrault, are possibly the two sort of greatest collectors in the sort of 19th century. And uh, I think the picture will be coming up here. There's the history of Bluebeard, which is about a pirate who marries and murders his wives. That seems to be sort of a source for this as well, where Rochester is sort of sequestering away his wife in a tower, and there's this sort of implication that there's something foul going on. In the sense that it's a kind of like a Cinderella story as well. It's another Bildungsroman, or what can be termed a maturation plot, a sort of rites of passage text and narrative, and it goes from childhood through to obviously maturation and eventual marriage in what is a sort of a romance story. There's no question about that. 2011 version, interestingly enough, if you've watched that, and I think quite a few people might have, tells it the other way around, and the story is very much a series of flashbacks from the present, which is on the moor before them being reunited. So there are interesting ways of refiguring this plot and its narration and storytelling, which sometimes has to be done for example, radio plays, so you can actually see what's going on, or it has to be told instead, or in film. So it can be seen as very much a rags to riches type plot if we're looking at and a Bildungsroman or maturation plot. And definitely as a sort of rerun of a Cinderella type story. There's an important intertext written by Jean Rhys in 1966, which is called The Wide Sargasso Sea, which is well worth looking at, which retells the story in a typical, what we describe as post-colonial text, because it refocuses and revoices the story and tells it from the perspective of Bertha Mason, who in this, of course, is our monster, but our monster that's nothing more than a typical case of British colonialism and the results of slavery. So all of that together produces a story that's incredibly rich, very intense, full of drama, and is very typical of Romanticism on the one hand. The New Gothic, as Professor Bowen terms it, often sometimes termed as female Gothic as well, where the Gothic is sort of reset into a greater degree of realism as well. Early Gothic was sort of sensationalist, and if you want to get a hold on some of the Anne Radcliffe stories in early Gothic, then watch Northanger Abbey, which I've linked to on the YouTube site, because that's actually woven into the narrative, where they're all reading The Monk and the Castle of Otranto, etc. But here we've got a sort of mixing of romantic, Gothic, fairy tale, and realism in Jane Eyre. Just a quick reminder that you've got, there's Fassbender in the 2011 version, steaming away over there. Great actor of our generation, no question about it. Is that you've got four different sort of types of plot structures when we analyze them that you can look at. And we've just mentioned some of them, so this could be quite interesting. Often you have a dramatic or progressive plot, which normally builds up with rising action to some kind of climax. And then you have resolution or denouement, where everything is resolved at the end. And very often you might have different phases where things go better, then things go worse, then things go better again before final resolution. But it's a very generally quite simplistic sort of narrative arc where you have rising action and then to a climax and then you have a resolve at the end. When we've looked at things like A Heart of Darkness, certainly, and Huckleberry Finn, these have been episodic plots where very typical of travel literature, where you go on a journey, and so you have different little episodes that are not necessarily interlinked and could have nothing to do with each other, rather like the wreck with the pirates in Huckleberry Finn, which is a self-contained little episode that doesn't seem to affect anything else in the rest of the story. Typical of 19th century is the beginning of multiple narratives or parallel plots, where the story is told by two different people or in two different ways, and from different perspectives. And we'll be getting to examples of this as we go along. First thing that I can think of that with a simple double narrative or parallel plot that comes to mind is uh, Charles Dickens' Bleak House from 1851 to 2 when it was first published, which has one plot line reconstructed from letters and the other told as if it's in the present, and they run parallel to each other and then converge at the end. And then the 2011 version of Jane Eyre that I was just discussing is in media res. It uses a series of flashbacks, which is a very, very typical storytelling device that was really began in film very strongly and was used a lot in film. Here you cut straight to what is almost like an end scene, or towards the end where she's stranded on a moor, and then through a series of flashbacks we catch up to the present as the present slowly is interwoven with the past. It's like a parallel plot, but it's a series of flashbacks. And in media res means in the middle of things, in the midst, because you cut straight to the middle of the action. You could also think of just like recounting things that I would probably normally discuss or bring up or touch on first in English too. Book of 7 types of stories, not plots, stories without any thought to how it's then reorganized into a text through narration or through telling it from different perspectives. And I sort of touched on some of these here. Here's the frontispiece, the title page for the history of Bluebeard. Over there, price 1 penny, which meant it would have got massive circulation, obviously, so it was a copy that was for every man in that sort of sense. Booker, after I think his book actually took 34 years to write, he sort of analysed tens upon thousands of plots and stories, books, and looked at the actual story, so not how it's then reorganised to be told. And he came up with these 7 types, which is quite interesting. Overcoming the monster. We can see an example of this in Frankenstein straight away, or you could even see it in George and the Dragon, couldn't you? There's a beast that has to be slain. Rebirth, where the character is reborn through transformation or metamorphosis in some sense, becomes anew. The quest to go and get something, or to could also possibly be written as a rescue plot, to rescue somebody, a quest to save somebody, normally involving some sort of travel. The journey and return that you might see in Lord of the Rings, Bilbo there and back again, which again of a lot of our writing involved travel, writing or fiction. The Cinderella plot of rags to riches that we see rerunning in Jane Eyre. Tragedy, where through some essential fault of the character or something that they can't avoid themselves, rather like Frankenstein here, there's a tragedy because he's made as he is. And therefore we already know at the beginning that he's doomed to failure. And comedy as well, which obviously includes some sort of overcoming of difficult circumstances, normally in a comic, light or ironic tone, and you'd include romance, or Booker includes romance in comedy. So in terms of themes and conventions, you can see lots going on in Jane Eyre, and I've touched on a lot of this already, the folklore, fairy tale, Cinderella story, the new Gothic, of its very sort of Gothic settings, of the castles, of the monster, the doubling of, sorry, I'm just going to click stay on top there, thank you. The doubling of Bertha and Jane is something I'm going to pick up on because this is very strong indeed, as 2 characters, one the rags to riches, but the story of Bertha is very different indeed. The element of the Gothic that actually represents colonialism and slavery in this story that's really, really interesting, where that intrusion of the supernatural is not the supernatural at all. Oh, it's just the fact that we've got a plantation on a colony with lots of slaves. Whoopsie. And linked to that is the idea, of course, of ethnicity and race, because Bertha is of mixed parentage, likely born through slave rape on a plantation, and in that sense as well, the meeting with the supernatural, it's not just a meeting with the supernatural, it's a meeting with the classic, the other, the exotic, and in that sense we can link it back again to sort of to Crusoe, to Gulliver, to all of our books. The other very strong theme, of course, that comes out of that is it's likely to be induced by syphilis, isn't it? Madness of Bertha. Um, and madness is a form of the New Gothic as well, where the old sense of just supernatural is kind of individualized and psychologized into this intense emotion, intense romantic emotion of madness, which is where a lot of people think romanticism naturally leads. Gosh, it's almost quarter past, so I better push on to a stop point here as well, so we can go for lunch as well. Maybe that's a good point to draw to a close. I'm just going to finish up with this idea of the doubling here. Here we've got taking the candle, it retreated to the door. And a lot of you are beginning to sort of compare this figure, look at it there, with some sort of ghost-like supernatural monster. It says this was purple, the lips were swelled and dark, the brow furrowed, the black eyes widely raised over the bloodshot eyes. Shall I tell you of what it reminded me? You may. Of the foul German spectre, the vampire, which is what Byron and the Shelleys were reading in that extract in Geneva before Shelley wrote Frankenstein. And it's the same, the vampire, that was then, again, for price one penny, guaranteeing wide circulation that was produced after that based on those German stories. And we can fall from that and sort of draw out of that that piece that a lot of you read there in the deep shade at the further end of the room. A figure ran backwards and forwards. What it was, whether beast or human being, one could not at first sight tell. It grovelled seemingly on all fours, it snatched and growled like some strange wild animal, but it was covered with clothing, and a quantity of dark, grizzled hair, wild as a man, hid its head and face. When we go forward after the break as well to read from Heart of Darkness, it might be very useful to then compare these kind of passages to the passages that are selected in the readings in Heart of Darkness that describe native Africans as being inhuman, and unearthly. Okay, I think that's good. I think that's enough for one session and a good start point here on that presentation. I will sort of